January 1945. The Ardennes forest is frozen in the grip of one of the harshest winters in living memory. Outside the command trailers, the snow is stained with the soot of battle and the blood of thousands. The German offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, is finally receding, leaving behind a landscape of shattered trees and exhausted men. But inside a dimly lit caravan in Zonhoven, Belgium, a different kind of war is being waged. It is a silent conflict, fought not with artillery or tanks, but with the sharp clack of a typewriter. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery sits alone, composing a message that carries more destructive potential for the Allied cause than a panzer division. In the vacuum left by the chaos of battle, professional rivalries have hardened into something dangerous. The telegram on the desk is not merely a critique of strategy. It is a fundamental challenge to the American command structure. It represents the moment when the friction between the old British Empire and the rising American superpower threatens to fracture the coalition just months before victory. This is the story of how a few lines of text nearly destroyed the alliance that saved the world. Asterisk. By the winter of 1944, the facade of the Allied coalition remained polished for the public eye. Newsreels depicted American and British generals shaking hands, sharing maps, and smiling under the banner of a united crusade against fascism. Yet behind the closed doors of the command trailers and the converted shadows serving as headquarters, the reality was a structure groaning under immense psychological weight. The special relationship was not a friendship born of mutual affection. It was a marriage of necessity, held together by the gravity of a common enemy. As the Allied armies approached the German border, that gravity began to weaken, and the fissures in the foundation became visible. The tension was rooted in the divergent realities of the two nations. The United States was a rising superpower, flexing its industrial muscles, its armies growing daily in size and confidence. Great Britain, conversely, was an empire in twilight, bankrupt and exhausted. After 5 years of total war, London was scraping the bottom of its manpower reserves. Every British soldier lost was a soldier who could not be replaced. This disparity created two fundamentally different approaches to warfare. The Americans could afford a war of attrition and aggression. The British required caution, conservation, and control. At the center of this friction stood two men who embodied their nation's conflicting philosophies. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, was the architect of consensus. He was not a tactical visionary in the Napoleonic sense. He was an executive manager of war. Operating from the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, Eisenhower's role was to harmonize the competing egos of the alliance. He absorbed the stress of command with a practiced stoicism, chain-smoking through endless meetings, mediating disputes, and maintaining the delicate political balance required to keep the coalition from collapsing. He viewed the war as a broad, collaborative effort, relying on the sheer weight of Allied material superiority to grind the Wehrmacht into dust across the entire front. Opposite him stood Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the commander of the 21st Army Group. Montgomery was a soldier of the old school, a man defined by rigid discipline, meticulous preparation, and absolute control. To Montgomery, war was a set-piece battle, a chessboard where the grandmaster moved pieces with precise intent. He viewed the American approach dynamic, improvised, and spread across a broad front as unprofessional and dangerously sloppy. Montgomery did not see Eisenhower as his superior in military intellect. He viewed him as a nice chap, suitable for handling logistics and politics, while the actual business of fighting should be left to the professionals. And in Montgomery's mind, the only true professionals on the continent were British. The friction had been building since the breakout from Normandy. Montgomery had consistently argued for a single thrust strategy, a concentrated, dagger-like strike into the heart of Germany, led, inevitably, by himself. He believed that the war could be ended by Christmas 1944 if Eisenhower would only halt the American armies in the South and divert all supplies to the British in the North. Eisenhower refused. He adhered to the broad front strategy, advancing all armies simultaneously to stretch the German defenses out to Montgomery. This refusal was not just a strategic error. It was a personal slight. As the autumn rains turned to winter snow and the Allied advance stalled at the Siegfried Line, Montgomery's resentment calcified into a dangerous certainty. He became convinced that the Americans were incapable of finishing the war without his direct guidance. In his private diaries and communications with London, the tone shifted from critique to condescension. He waited for the moment when the American system would fail, proving him right. He did not know that the Wehrmacht was about to provide him with exactly that opportunity in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, setting the stage for a conflict that would move from the battlefield to the telegraph wires. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the illusion of Allied dominance shattered along an 80-mile stretch of the front known as the Ghost Front. The Ardennes, a region of dense pine forests and rolling hills, was considered by Allied intelligence to be a quiet sector, a resting ground for battered divisions. This complacency was exploited by the German High Command with ruthless efficiency. Under the cover of heavy fog that grounded the superior Allied Air Force, 3 German armies launched Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. The ferocity of the assault was absolute. Panzer divisions punched through the thin American lines, creating chaos, cutting communication wires, and isolating units in the snow for the Supreme Headquarters. The initial reports were fragmentary and confusing. It took days for the scale of the disaster to manifest on the situation maps at Versailles. By December 19th, a massive salient, the Bulge, had been driven deep into the Allied front. The German thrust had achieved a critical geometric effect. It physically severed the lines of communication between General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, headquarters in Luxembourg, and his forces in the north. The U.S. First Army under Courtney Hodges and the U.S. Ninth Army under William Simpson were effectively cut off from their own command structure. Eisenhower, staring at the logistics, made a decision that was purely functional but politically radioactive. Recognizing that Bradley could no longer effectively control the northern shoulder of the battle, Eisenhower ordered a temporary command shift. On December 20th, he placed the 2 stranded American armies comprising some 200,000 soldiers and massive material assets under the operational control of Field Marshal Montgomery and the British 21st Army Group to Eisenhower. This was a provisional measure dictated by geography. To Montgomery, it was a coronation. The Field Marshal did not view this transfer as a desperate loan to stabilize a crisis. He interpreted it as the long-delayed recognition of his superior military intellect. For months, he had argued that the American command structure was disjointed and that the front lacked a single, strong land commander. Now, with the Americans reeling and their lines broken, Montgomery believed the evidence was irrefutable. The broad front strategy had failed. Just as he had predicted, Montgomery moved with characteristic speed, but his manner was that of a stern headmaster stepping in to discipline unruly students. He immediately imposed his own liaison system, dispatching young British officers to American headquarters. These phantom officers, as they were known, reported directly to Montgomery, often bypassing the American chain of command. When Montgomery arrived personally at the headquarters of the U.S. First Army, the atmosphere turned glacial. The American staff, exhausted and traumatized by the ferocity of the German assault, did not find a sympathetic ally. They found a critic. Montgomery's first order of business was to tidy up the battlefield. He halted American counterattacks he deemed premature. He ordered withdrawals from exposed positions to create a shorter, more defensible line. Militarily, these decisions were sound. They allowed the Allies to absorb the German momentum and build a solid defensive wall. Psychologically, however, they were devastating. To the American commanders, who were culturally conditioned to hold ground and attack aggressively, Montgomery's caution felt like defeatism. They were fighting for survival, bleeding for every yard of the Ardennes, while Montgomery seemed obsessed with reorganization and geometric perfection. The friction was immediate. Montgomery treated the veteran American generals not as peers, but as subordinates who required remedial training. He vetoed Bradley's plans to pinch off the German salient at the base, preferring the methodical squeeze from the north. In the freezing cold of the command trailers, the resentment began to boil. The Americans felt they were being patronized by a man who had barely engaged the enemy, while Montgomery genuinely believed he was the only thing standing between the U.S. Army and total annihilation. He saw himself as the savior of the northern flank, unaware that his manner was sowing the seeds of a crisis that would soon eclipse the battle itself. As the calendar turned from 1944 to 1945, the physical crisis of the Battle of the Bulge began to subside. General George Patton's Third Army had broken the siege of Bastogne from the south, and the German fuel reserves were running dry. The immediate threat of an Allied collapse had passed. However, as the roar of the artillery began to diminish, the clatter of the teleprinters in the Allied command trailers grew deafening. The war against the Germans was being won. The war between the Allies was entering its most volatile phase. In the seclusion of his tactical headquarters, Field Marshal Montgomery felt his position was unassailable. He had been given command of the American armies in the north, and in his view, he had saved them from destruction. Now, he intended to leverage this temporary tactical success into a permanent strategic victory. He did not direct his grievances to General Eisenhower, his immediate superior. Instead, he turned his gaze across the channel, initiating a back-channel dialogue with Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff in London, between December 25th and January 1st. The telegraph wires connecting Belgium to London carried a stream of toxicity that would have stunned the American public. In these secret communiques, Montgomery stripped away the diplomatic niceties of the alliance. He was no longer offering constructive criticism. He was drafting an indictment. On December 27th, Montgomery sent a message to Brooke that contained a scathing assessment of his allies. "The Americans are in a complete shambles," he wrote. "There is no grip anywhere." This phrase, "no grip," was the ultimate insult in Montgomery's lexicon. It implied a lack of professional control, a descent into amateurism. He painted a picture of the American command as a headless chicken, running on panic and adrenaline, devoid of the cool, rational intellect that he believed he provided. He claimed that without his intervention, the entire Northern Front would have disintegrated. It was a narrative of British salvation and American incompetence, constructed entirely within the echo chamber of his own headquarters. The correspondence grew more damaging. Montgomery moved beyond criticizing the generals to attacking the fundamental quality of the U.S. Army. In a subsequent letter, he expressed the view that American troops were brave but useless. He argued that they lacked the proper training and leadership to function effectively in modern warfare without British guidance. This was a profound misreading of the reality on the ground. At that very moment, isolated pockets of American infantry were holding the line against SS panzer divisions with grim determination, inflicting casualties that would break the back of the Wehrmacht in the West. Montgomery, looking at his maps and reports from his liaison officers, saw only the mésaines of their deployment, not the resilience of their resistance. Montgomery's objective in this paper war was specific. He was lobbying Brooke to pressure Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who would then pressure Washington. The goal was to force Eisenhower to hand over full operational control of all ground forces to a single commander, Montgomery. He was effectively demanding that Eisenhower be demoted to a figurehead, A political chairman while Montgomery ran the war, he assumed his prestige protected him. He believed that the logic of his argument was so overwhelming that London and Washington would have no choice but to acquiesce. He failed to realize that these telegrams were not staying secret. The sentiments expressed in them were leaking, poisoning the atmosphere at Schaeff. Eisenhower, though patient, was not blind. He was beginning to sense that his subordinate was not just difficult, but actively undermining his authority. Montgomery was playing a high-stakes game of poker, betting his career against the patience of the United States, unaware that the hand he was holding was far weaker than he realized. The tension that had been building in the secret cables and the command trailers finally erupted into the public sphere on January 7, 1945. Field Marshal Montgomery, sensing that the battle was won and that the time was right to shape the historical narrative, convened a press conference at his headquarters in Zonhoven. He stood before a gathered assembly of war correspondents, a figure of supreme confidence in his trademark beret. For 30 minutes he spoke. It was a performance intended to project unity and British professionalism. Instead, it became one of the most spectacular public relations disasters in military history. Montgomery's speech was a masterclass in unintentional solipsism. He began by describing the battle not as a desperate defensive struggle by surprised American units, but as an engaging tactical problem that he had solved. He characterized the crisis as a situation where the Americans were flailing until he arrived to impose order. "I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies," he declared, painting a picture of a massive British rescue operation. He described the battle as one of the most interesting and tricky he had ever handled, reducing a slaughter to an intellectual puzzle. The psychological disconnect was staggering. In the transcript of the conference, Montgomery used the first-person singular pronoun, I, 57 times. He used we, referring to the British, almost exclusively when discussing success. He barely mentioned General Omar Bradley, the American commander whose troops had borne the brunt of the fighting. He made no mention of General Patton's heroic relief of Bastogne, a logistical miracle executed in a blizzard. To a listener unacquainted with the facts, it sounded as though the British Army had single-handedly stopped Hitler's panzers while the Americans stood by, grateful to be rescued. The data reveals the cruelty of this distortion. The Battle of the Bulge was overwhelmingly an American fight. By the time of the press conference, the United States Army had suffered nearly 89,000 casualties in the Ardennes, men killed, wounded, or missing in the snow. The British 30th Corps, which Montgomery had held in reserve until the final stages, had suffered approximately 1,400 casualties. The disparity in blood sacrifice was enormous. For Montgomery to claim credit for the victory was not just a breach of etiquette. It was a theft of valor. When the transcript of the press conference reached the American headquarters, the reaction was visceral. General Omar Bradley, a man known as the Guise General for his mild manner and lack of pretension, was incandescent with rage. For weeks, Bradley had swallowed his pride, accepting Montgomery's temporary command for the sake of the mission. He had endured the patronizing lectures from British liaison officers, but this public humiliation was a bridge too far. He felt that his professional reputation and the honor of his soldiers had been trampled for the sake of Montgomery's ego. Bradley walked to his situation map, slammed his fist against the board, and made a declaration that threatened to shatter the Allied command structure permanently. He told his staff that he would resign rather than serve under Montgomery again. General Patton, never one for restraint, echoed the sentiment, threatening to go to the press with the truth about who had actually won the battle. Montgomery, isolated in his own bubble of self-assurance, had no idea of the storm he had unleashed. He believed the press conference had gone well. He thought he had been generous to the Americans by mentioning their bravery. He failed to understand that in coalition warfare, tone is as important as tactics. By framing the victory as a British triumph over American chaos, he had transformed a professional disagreement into a deep personal betrayal. The telegrams had lit the fuse. The press conference caused the explosion. The time for diplomacy was over. The crisis was now heading to the desk of the Supreme Commander. The news of Montgomery's press conference arrived at the Supreme Headquarters in Versailles like a blast wave. For Dwight D. Eisenhower, it was the final cumulative weight that broke the back of his patience. For 3 years, the Supreme Commander had functioned as a shock absorber for the alliance, absorbing the friction of clashing national interests and titanic egos. He had placated Montgomery in North Africa, in Sicily, and in Normandy, always prioritizing unity over his own personal pride. But as he read the transcript of the press conference compounded by the intelligence reports regarding Montgomery's secret back-channeling to London something within Eisenhower shifted irrevocably. The reaction at SHAEF was not one of noisy outrage, but of terrifying stillness. Eisenhower sat at his desk, the smoke from his cigarette curling in the cold air, and accepted a hard truth. The command structure was no longer functional. Montgomery was not merely a difficult subordinate. He had become a liability to the war effort. The field marshal's public preening and private plotting had made it impossible for the American generals, specifically Bradley and Patton, to serve alongside him. The trust required to coordinate millions of men in battle had evaporated. Eisenhower did not shout. He did not throw objects. Instead, he reached for a pad of paper and began to draft a cable to General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff in Washington. The language was polite, bureaucratic, and absolutely lethal. Eisenhower laid out the situation with clinical detachment. He explained that the differences between himself and Field Marshal Montgomery were no longer bridgeable. He stated that he could no longer work with the British commander. Then, he delivered the ultimatum. Eisenhower wrote that if Montgomery's attitude and presence were deemed essential to the alliance, he, Eisenhower, requested to be relieved of his command immediately. It was a binary choice, him or me. This was the nuclear option of coalition politics. Eisenhower knew exactly how Washington would respond. By January 1945, the geopolitical reality of the war had shifted decisively. The United States was supplying nearly 80% of the material and 70% of the combat troops in the European theater. The British Empire, exhausted and financially ruined, was relying on American lend-lease for everything from tank engines to tinned meat. Eisenhower knew that General Marshall would never fire the American Supreme Commander to appease a British subordinate. By offering his own resignation, Eisenhower was effectively putting a gun to the head of the British High Command and pulling the trigger. The gravity of the situation was realized almost instantly by Major General Francis de Gingand, Montgomery's Chief of Staff. De Gingand was the unsung hero of the 21st Army Group, a diplomat in uniform who spent his days smoothing over the feathers Montgomery ruffled. Visiting Schaeff, he saw the draft of the cable. He saw the cold resolve in Eisenhower's eyes. De Gingand realized with horror that the end of the war effort as a joint enterprise was imminent. If Eisenhower sent that cable, Montgomery would be fired in disgrace. The British public would be outraged, the American public would be vindicated, and the alliance would fracture into bitterness right at the catastrophic doorstep of Berlin. The power dynamic was laid bare. The era of British dominance, of the senior partner guiding the junior American cousin, was dead. The United States held the purse strings, the manpower, and the industrial might. Eisenhower's draft was not just a personnel complaint. It was a declaration of American supremacy. He was asserting the right of the majority shareholder to fire the manager. De Gingand begged for time. He asked Eisenhower to hold the cable for 24 hours, promising to fly to Montgomery's headquarters and make him understand the precipice upon which he stood. Eisenhower agreed, but his face remained hard. The time for negotiation was over. The ultimatum sat on the desk, a silent testament to the fact that the special relationship had run out of credit. In London, the realization of the crisis struck Winston Churchill with the force of a physical blow. The Prime Minister was a man of deep sentiment, a romantic who cherished the special relationship above all else. But he was also a ruthless realist who could read a balance sheet. When he learned of Eisenhower's draft cable, the ultimatum that would demand Montgomery's removal, Churchill understood instantly that there was no maneuvering room left. The British Empire, for all its history and prestige, was now a junior partner in a war it could no longer afford to fight alone. Churchill knew he could not protect his favorite general. If it came to a choice between Montgomery and the flow of American supplies, Montgomery would have to go. The Prime Minister summoned his staff, the adoration he usually held for the hero of Alaman evaporating in the heat of geopolitical necessity. He recognized that Montgomery's ego had finally written a check that the British government could not cash. There would be no speeches to Parliament to smooth this over. There would only be immediate capitulation or disaster. The burden of delivering this reality fell to Major General Francis de Gingand. Flying through winter skies back to the tactical headquarters in Zonhoven, de Gingand carried the weight of the alliance in his briefcase. When he arrived at Montgomery's caravan, he found the Field Marshal in a mood of perplexing calm. Montgomery, still insulated by his own hubris, believed the storm had passed. He greeted his chief of staff, expecting a routine update on logistics. Instead, de Gingand laid the facts on the table with brutal clarity. He explained that Eisenhower was not merely annoyed. He was finished. He described the resignation cable sitting on the desk at Versailles. He told Montgomery, in terms that stripped away all rank and pretense, that if he did not apologize immediately and unequivocally, he would be relieved of command within days. He would return to England not as a conquering hero, but as the man who wrecked the alliance on the eve of victory. For the first time in the war, the mask of the infallible commander slipped. Witnesses described Montgomery as looking suddenly small, a man physically shrinking under the weight of the revelation. The arrogance that had fueled the secret telegrams and the disastrous press conference disintegrated when faced with the cold, hard wall of American power. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he was not indispensable. He was an employee, and the owners of the company were preparing to let him go. The scene in the caravan that night was one of pitiful submission. De Gingand, acting more as a guardian than a subordinate, produced a draft of a letter he had already prepared. He knew that Montgomery, left to his own devices, might try to qualify his apology or insert a subtle justification. De Gingand would not allow it. He placed the pen in the Field Marshal's hand and dictated the terms of his surrender. Montgomery wrote the letter to Eisenhower. It was the most difficult document of his life. "Dear Ike," it began, "I am distressed that my press conference has caused you trouble." He went on to offer the assurance that he would never intentionally damage the Supreme Commander's authority. But the crucial lines were those that directly contradicted his earlier secret telegrams. He wrote, "Your American soldiers are brave and fighting magnificently. It is an honor to serve beside them." The closing salutation was the final nail in the coffin of his ambition. De Gingand ensured that the language left no room for interpretation regarding who was in charge. Montgomery signed the letter, "Your very devoted subordinate, Monty." Subordinate. With that single word, the power struggle was over. Montgomery had formally acknowledged his place in the hierarchy. The letter was dispatched immediately to Versailles. When Eisenhower read it the next morning, he did not gloat. He simply took the draft of his own resignation, crumpled it up, and threw it in the wastebasket. He replied with a short, magnanimous note, "Thanks, Monty. Let's get on with the war." The crisis was diffused, the firing squad stood down, but the dynamic of the Western Front had changed forever. The apology letter of January 1945 did its job. It saved Field Marshal Montgomery from ignominy and preserved the facade of Allied unity for the newsreels. However, while the title on Montgomery's door remained unchanged, the atmosphere inside the Supreme headquarters had been irrevocably altered. The apology had saved the man, but it had killed his influence. Eisenhower, having held the resignation letter in his hand, realized that he no longer needed to tiptoe around the sensitivities of the British High Command. He had called their bluff, and they had folded. From that day forward, the strategic debate that had plagued the alliance since Normandy was effectively over. Montgomery's dream of a single concentrated British thrust into Berlin, a move that would have placed the Union Jack at the forefront of victory, was quietly discarded. Eisenhower's broad front strategy became the law of the land. The Allied armies would advance as a relentless uniform wave, a strategy that favored American industrial might over British tactical finesse. Eisenhower stopped listening to the lectures from London. He simply pointed to the map and gave orders. Confident that the political capital of the British Empire was exhausted. The reality of this new hierarchy played out on the banks of the Rhine. In March 1945, Montgomery, true to his nature, spent weeks preparing a massive, meticulous operation to cross the river in the north. He amassed thousands of guns, tens of thousands of tons of supplies, and planned a set-piece battle reminiscent of the First World War. Eisenhower allowed it, but he also unleashed the American dogs of war in the South. While Montgomery was still rehearsing, American units under Generals Hodges and Patton seized the bridge at Remagen and slipped across the river at Oppenheim. They didn't wait for a grand plan. They simply moved. By the time Montgomery launched his great offensive, the Americans were already deep inside Germany, stealing the glory of the final conquest. By May 1945, the arithmetic of war had rendered the debate moot. The United States Army in Europe numbered over 3 million men. The British contribution, though valiant and professional, was dwarfed by the sheer scale of the American presence. When the victory photos were finally taken, the visual language was undeniable. Eisenhower stood in the center, the Titan of the West. Montgomery stood to the side, a respected but diminished figure. The useless Americans, as Monty had once called them, were now the undisputed masters of the continent. History tends to remember the Battle of the Bulge for the physical struggle, the freezing foxholes of Bastogne, the massacre at Malmedy, and the desperate courage of the airborne troops. But the most dangerous moment of that winter did not happen in the snow. It happened in a telegraph office. The alliance that saved Western civilization was not a predestined bond of brotherhood. It was a fragile construct, nearly shattered by the vanity of one man and saved only by the cold pragmatism of another. Winston Churchill's intervention did more than soothe a bruised ego. It prevented the West from fracturing in the face of the Soviet advance. Yet, the telegrams remain a scar on the history of this special relationship. They serve as a stark reminder that in coalition warfare, words are as lethal as bullets. Montgomery believed that his genius exempted him from the rules of diplomacy. He learned, in the hardest way possible, that in the modern age, military brilliance is secondary to industrial and political power. The war moved on. The telegrams were buried in the archives, stamped top secret, and hidden from the public for decades. But they mark a specific point in time, the moment the baton of global leadership passed from the fading grip of London to the confident hands of Washington. The British Empire did not end with a bang, but with the clack of a typewriter in a snowy trailer and the quiet realization that the world had changed.